We can start. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today. This event is about Hong Kong's rule of law and democracy. And Professor Johanna and Ransmeier and I will be moderating the conversation. And I'm Teng Biao, a human rights lawyer from China. Currently, I'm a Pozen visiting professor at Pozen Family Center for Human Rights at University of Chicago. And Professor Johanna Ransmeier is a historian. She's a scholar on Chinese legal history, and her book on human trafficking was published in 2017. And this semester, Johanna and I are co-teaching a course, Human Rights in China. So this event is the second of four talks in the series. So Johanna, please.
Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Teng Biao. I was saying before the seminar that I felt sheepish being introduced by Teng Biao because it's such an honor to be co-teaching with established Wei-Chen lawyer who's worked so hard for democracy. We want to thank our sponsors, the Pozen Family Center for Human Rights, the Center for East Asian Studies, and the Department of History. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. And if you're rejoining us, welcome back. Today, Teng Biao and I are joined by Professors Michael Davis, Victoria Hui, and Georgetown doctoral student and democracy activist Jeffrey Ngo to discuss the future of rule of law and democracy in Hong Kong. I have heard Hong Kong activists describe the situation in Hong Kong as the ground zero for the conflict between authoritarianism and democracy. Beijing's determination to dismantle channels of free, peaceful expression has become increasingly self-evident. Hong Kong also offers an extreme test case for whether or not the PRC is capable of honoring its historical commitments, whether that promise be like the basic law or one country, two systems, or a more general commitment to rule of law in a global context. I will introduce our guests and then each of them will share a relatively brief presentation outlining events in Hong Kong and their perspective on recent developments. And then we'll open the floor up for questions. Teng Biao and I will together help moderate those. We may add some questions of our own. And you, of course, should add your questions at any time using the Zoom Q&A function. Please feel free to remain anonymous or identify yourself and any institutional affiliation you would like to share. Questions will generally remain invisible to the general audience unless the panelists choose to provide a quick answer to a brief factual question in text form. So our first panelist today is Professor Michael Davis. He's a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., an affiliate research scholar at the U.S. Asia Law Institute in New York City, and professor of law and international affairs at O.P. Jindal Global University in India. Truly someone who is in the moment in many places at one time. What is most relevant for us is his longstanding public intellectual commitment in Hong Kong. He was a professor in the law faculty at the University of Hong Kong until late 2016. His scholarship engages a range of issues relating to human rights, the rule of law, and constitutionalism in emerging states. He has many publications in public affairs journals, but most notably, perhaps, the Hong Kong FCC awarded him a 2014 Human Rights Press Award for his commentary in the South China Morning Post on the 2014 Umbrella Movement. His latest book, Making Hong Kong China, The Rollback of Human Rights and the Rule of Law, is a perfect starting point in a way for the conversation I think he's going to get us started with today, which involves understanding the historical commitments to Hong Kong and the significance of the most recent changes in Hong Kong and between Hong Kong and Beijing. With that, I will give the floor to Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna, and Teng Biao. Thank you as well. I'll try to be quick on this. I know that time is limited. What I want to do is, in a sense, show something that I think is very common for Americans, and that is a lot of debate in Hong Kong is centered around its constitution. In effect, for Hong Kong, this constitution is the Hong Kong Basic Law. so that I think is really important in understanding this. And so a kind of the legal timeline, if you will, of what occurred in Hong Kong and why people are protesting and all of that tells a good part of the story that we're concerned about in Hong Kong. Many, I don't know in terms of our audience, how many are very expert on Hong Kong or may not know a lot. So I'll point out the Hong Kong Basic Law, which came into force in 1997, promised Hong Kong a high degree of autonomy, that the common law system would be maintained, human rights and basic freedoms would be maintained, the courts would be independent and final. And all of this was a part of China's effort to carry out its commitments under a treaty, an international treaty that's registered with the UN. It's unambiguous. The Sino-British Joint Declaration is a treaty and it's part of China's obligations. Hong Kong people, before this agreement was reached, were very nervous about the future of Hong Kong because signals were already given that Hong Kong would revert to China in 1997. That nervousness was expressed in immigration. A lot of people were leaving Hong Kong. And so when this treaty was reached and promises were made and Chinese officials said to Hong Kong people and international investors and others who rely on Hong Kong should put their hearts at ease, I think there was some sense that people put their hearts at ease and were hopeful about the future. And so as I started out saying, it was kind of like the US Constitution. We know Dr. Martin Luther King was basically protesting to demand the US carry out its commitments under its own constitution. In a way, that's what pretty much all protests in Hong Kong have been about, a demand that China carry out its commitments under the Basic Law. And so it's very important. I in a book, the book that was just mentioned, I highlight there were two areas where I thought the Basic Law was a bit weak. One was that it gave Chinese government, the National People's Congress Standing Committee, the power to interpret the Basic Law, in effect, a superior position to the courts. And it exercised that power right after the handover in 1999. And as a result, I think the courts in Hong Kong were always a bit nervous when sensitive cases came up that Beijing would step in and overrule them. So there was this kind of threat. If the Hong Kong agreement was about anything, it was about maintaining the rule of law in Hong Kong. Hong Kong had not been a democracy, but it had the rule of law and a high degree of protection of human rights and so on. And so if the rule of law was weakened by China's ability to overreach, that was one big concern. And I think one that drove a lot of the protest in Hong Kong over the years. The other thing in the Basic Law that has been very important is that it promised that the ultimate aim was universal suffrage in Hong Kong, that in effect, Hong Kong people were to rule themselves under one person, one vote with a genuine election. That's what people expected. And as years went on after the handover and people saw the Hong Kong government that was in place was often submissive to Chinese officials on the mainland and complicit sometimes in mainland interference, I think Hong Kong people, in their wisdom, decided that it was very important that this commitment to universal suffrage be carried out so that they would have a government in place that would defend Hong Kong's autonomy, the autonomy that was so important to maintaining the rule of law. So this is sort of the set stage on which all of this operated. And as the years went on, Chinese officials tended to more and more interfere in Hong Kong. They put back the promise of democracy. So protests went to the streets. The first sign of interference was an attempt under the Basic Law. And the Basic Law provided that Hong Kong would enact national security laws on its own. And the government in Hong Kong was pushed to do that very early in the process in 2003. And the law that was proposed under what was called Article 23 was not compliant with international human rights commitments, and massive protests took place in Hong Kong. I was actually a member of the Article 23 concern group, so we were involved in trying to inform the public on why we were concerned about this national security law. And it was really until 2019, perhaps the largest protest in Hong Kong, where 500,000 protesters were on the street. There were other massive ones as well, but that figure was fairly high until 2019, when we see over, up to 2 million people protesting about what was being done. So this basic law was relied on. It was very explicit. It said that mainland officials should not interfere in Hong Kong. Mainland departments, as it said, under the central government. And it said mainland laws would not apply except for a very limited number that might be listed in Annex 3. So we went through all these ups and downs over the years. There were protests over national education in 2012, when a lot of the young people that became very prominent activists led protests when they were still in high school, 14 years old, as low as that. And pushing back against, again, we have to assume mainland effort to encourage the Hong Kong government to introduce what was called national education. Many people called it patriotic education. And the idea, I think, for the youngsters on the street was that it was an attempt at brainwashing. And so both these Article 23 proposals and the national education proposals actually were withdrawn when people protested. So while the Hong Kong government was not defending autonomy, it seemed that the Hong Kong people were. They were doing their best to do so. And to the extent that it could, the courts were often involved in protecting their rights to do so. So this was the situation in 2014 when the massive umbrella movement came up. At this stage, China says, well, we will keep our commitment to universal suffrage and you can have it in 2017. And if the chief executive is elected in 2017 and 2020, then the Legislative Council could be elected by universal suffrage. But when it did so, it says, that under the basic law, there was an article that said that a nominating committee would choose the candidates for chief executive. And so when it said that Hong Kong might do this, it kind of said and used the word may. They may want to use an existing election committee. Well, what was the election committee? The election committee is the committee that chooses the chief executive before universal suffrage. In fact, the current chief executive was chosen by an election committee. So when this may word was used here, Hong Kong activists became active and said, well, we have to step in. And there was an attempt to plan what was called Occupy Central in love and peace. So protesters were very active in training and nonviolent tactics and everything. And they did occupy the streets for 79 days in 2014. But when it was all done, there were consultations over democratic reform and so on. But in August of 2019, Beijing said that the election committee would now have to be, not may, would have to be the nominating committee to choose candidates. And because the election committee was always about 80% pro-Beijing or pro-establishment figures, there was no way the voters would be given a genuine choice. And so that's why those protests occurred. Along came 2019, and this, I know this is fast. We're trying to get a sort of the character of all of this, the timeline. In 2019, again, it seemed Beijing was encouraging Hong Kong this time to enact extradition law. And Carrie Lam, the chief executive, she said she did this on her own. But in Hong Kong, either the government is being encouraged to do something, or sometimes if it's doing it on its own, the general perception is it's doing it to please Beijing, to accomplish something that Beijing wanted. And again, this proposal was made, and under this proposal, people arrested in Hong Kong from anywhere, including Hong Kongers, could be sent to the mainland if the mainland had charges to level against them. So again, massive protests occurred in June 9 and 16, first 1 million of 2019, and then 2 million protesters, all nonviolent, took to the streets. And there was no attempt by the government to listen to the people, which had been a problem throughout all of these various protests, that it was hard to get officials to listen. Even when they gave in over the Article 23 legislation in 2003, it was only at the last minute when one of the political parties that established the government, that supported the government, withdrew its support. So this has been a problem and a perception in Hong Kong. So in 2019, all the massive protests we heard about, and then this, eventually it's cracked down upon very aggressively by the police and so on. We all saw that in the news. So what happens after this? Well, it's not that they give in and listen to people, but this next time around, they propose national security laws. And these national security laws are very heavy-handed. They establish mainland offices in Hong Kong to safeguard national security. They establish a committee to safeguard national security, and neither one is subject to judicial review, that famous rule of law that Hong Kong people want. They set up special branches in the police and special branches in the Justice Department in Hong Kong. And they allow for secret investigations. They allow for warrantless searches. The national security law is also used to instruct universities and schools on national security and require them to impose it on their people and so on. All of these things, the press is intimidated under the national security law. Most notoriously, Jimmy Lai, a prominent publisher, is arrested, and he's being charged with national security offenses that could see him in jail for much of his life. And 47 opposition political figures, almost the entire opposition, was arrested because they organized a primary election. So all of this is going on, and it doesn't stop there. After that, we get the government, I guess it didn't feel that intimidating and arresting the opposition was enough. They impose an amendment of the Basic Law. That promise of universal suffrage seemingly has gone out the window because now they have a new election law that's included in the Basic Law. Both the national security law and this election law is imposed directly by Beijing. So the autonomy of Hong Kong is also put in question here. And the election law essentially sets it up so that no opposition candidate could dare to run. Because if they decided to run for election, they're going to be vetted by now an expanded election committee that's choosing the chief executive and nearly half of the legislative council. So all of this is going on. So basically what happens now is the police are called in to investigate every candidate for public office. And if they're not deemed patriotic, then they're not allowed to run. So I can imagine how hazardous it would be for a pro-democracy candidate to run if they ever said anything against the government or opposed the national security law, and assuming they're not already in jail. So this is basically blocking all opposition in Hong Kong. And the Beijing and the Hong Kong government are celebrating that they will now have a legislature that runs smoothly because there's no opposition in it. So this is just the spirit in a context and a very hasty timeline. I know Victoria Hoy has a lot to say about the process that surrounds all of this timeline, and Jeffrey as well. So I'll stop right here. I've probably used my 12 minutes.
Thank you very much, Michael. And now we're going to hear from Victoria Hoy, who is Associate Professor in Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. She received her PhD in Political Science from Columbia University and her BSSC in Journalism and Communication from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Hoy studies contentious politics and Hong Kong's democracy movement. She has testified at Congress and written for Foreign Affairs, the Journal of Democracy, and Washington Post Monkey Cage, and The Diplomat, and other channels. I'd like to add that our three speakers today, I think of them very much as Hong Kongers, even though they have CVs that base them all around the world. And so we're really lucky to be hearing people who are far from home, but reflecting on events at home. Hoy also examines the centrality of war in Chinese history, and she's published on state formation, constitutional rights, Confucian pacifism or Confucian confusion, coercive and cultural homogenization, and genocide in Chinese history. Which is a scope of, in her bio, it's a scope of really interesting things that speak across, to the historian and another historian on the panel, speak to really interesting ways in which the past resonates in the present and the kinds of crises we see in the present. And today, I believe she's going to reflect on the politics and consequences of the very dire deterioration of the legal and political situation in Hong Kong that Professor Davis has outlined. So Professor Hoy, without further ado, you are on.
Well, thank you so much for having me. So because the title of this panel is the rule of law, and let me just actually start by saying what exactly is the rule of law. The rule of law means everyone is equal before the law, and then no one is above the law. And this is very simple, except that something that we grew up taking for granted now doesn't exist in Hong Kong anymore. And let me just cite one example. On July 21st, 2019, hundreds of white-shirted thugs and also members of triad societies based in Yuen Long, they attacked protesters who were coming back from another protest that was happening on the Hong Kong side, and a lot of people got injured. And one of the legislators then, before he was forced to step down, was Lam Teng. And Lam Teng also happened to be one of Mike's former students. And he showed up and he was just trying to help. And then on that day, a journalist from this Stand News also got beaten up. And what happened aftermath? So on that day, the police were around, but they looked the other way. People were calling the police, calling the equivalent of 911. And the police complained that they were just overwhelmed. They were just overloaded. Apparently, some people were so mean that they just swarmed the line so that the emergency line didn't work instead of showing up. And there were images of police just basically, they appear near the site when all the beatings and attacks were happening, but they did not do anything to help. So what happened in the aftermath? So Lam Teng, he was one of the victims who got beaten and he had a bloody face. By the end of the day, he got charged for rioting on that day. And what happened to those thugs who were beating people up? Just a few that got arrested, and then so far there's been no charges. And in the aftermath too, RTHK, Radio Television Hong Kong, a publicly funded radio television station, they actually they used to be very good at digging up stories. They had one story months afterwards, and then another story last year, to just looking into who exactly were behind these attacks and why the white-shirted thugs could just get away with justice. So another person that got affected is that the producer of the second program of RTHK was charged with illegally misusing the licensing agreements, because the way that she could take the information out was to look at footage, to look at CCTV footage and identify the license number, and then check who actually had these cards with these license numbers, and trace back to essentially this collusion between the police and gangsters with Beijing background. And so this is the situation in Hong Kong. There's no rule of law. If we define the rule of law, essentially just in the most simple way, that everyone is equal before the law. No one is above the law. In Hong Kong today, the police are above the law. And then if you happen to be a member of the opposition, you happen to be one of the pro-democracy voices, you are subject to very harsh punishments. This is also what we would call a police state. Essentially, the police could do anything. The police could knock on your door. The police could arrest people. And then at the same time, whatever the other side do, whatever the people who support the regime do, they can get away with everything. And of course, then this also takes us to just, rule by law, that what we have today with the national security law, it is very harsh. It violates the international covenant on civil and political rights. But even though the national security law pays lip service to it in one of the early clauses, but by the end of the national security law, it also says that if there are any conflicts, then it will all be decided by the national security agents. And so we're living in this situation that is kind of like unimaginable. So yes, one of those from Hong Kong. When we were growing up, we trusted the police. We thought that these police officers were uncles and aunties. When I was little, my mother would tell me that, if you get lost, never trust strangers in the street. Go get help from police uncle, from police aunties. And Hong Kong's police used to be the world's, Asia's finest. And for many years, when we were holding those protests that Mike was referring to earlier in 2003, 2005, we were saying just high fives to these police officers. So how did Hong Kong descend to this point when the police used to be Asia's finest, would now become essentially be part of a police state intimidating everyone? Mike also did a very good job at outlining the events and how things evolve over time. Then one thing we also need to look at how those events unfolded was that every time Hong Kong people claim a victory, the other side the Beijing side would see every single victory as a defeat and would come down ever harder. And the national security law essentially means the culmination of this process. It started with 2003 that Mike also mentioned, because the basic law stipulates that Hong Kong has to enact its own national security law, and 500,000 people poured to the street. And why the government didn't really produce a better version? People were very upset. And in fact, Mike was one of those lawyers on the street handing out pamphlets explaining why the national security law was likely to violate the international covenants on civil and political rights, and therefore it should be significantly amended. Why they didn't want to do that? There's probably a good reason that maybe, any national security law that is in conformity with the international covenant would be of no teeth to really suppress Hong Kong people. The bill was shelved. Hong Kong people championed that as a victory. But from then on, it also began Beijing's infiltration of Hong Kong politics. Beijing set up the liaison office. It also began to use the liaison office to call up local politicians to be involved in essentially behind the scene mobilization at every single domestic local elections, whether it was for the legislative council or the district councils. Also started to fund a lot of these local communities, then with all the singing and dancing, so long as they would deliver votes for pro-Beijing candidates in subsequent elections. People these days talk about sharp power. Beijing and Russia's efforts to infiltrate into the fabric of society and democracies. Beijing tried that in Hong Kong, tested it very successfully. Mike also mentioned earlier that in 2012, Joshua Wong and also Jeffrey was also personally involved in protesting against the imposition of quote unquote national education. The policy was shelved after 100,000 people protested at the outside the central government offices. That again, for Beijing, it was a defeat. So they shelved the entire package, but national education, patriotic education continued to come in small pieces, split up into, for example, here and there in history, here and there in other subjects. But Hong Kong continued to basically stay away from national education for young people, and they continued to come out in force during the umbrella movement of 2014, and also during the anti-extradition protest of 2019. And in 2019, on June 9th, 1 million people poured to the street. The government refused to withdraw the extradition bill. But what they did then was that right before another planned march, Carrie Lam said that we would suspend the bill. 2 million people marched to pour out afterwards. It's not enough that you said you're going to suspend the bill. We want you to completely withdraw the bill. That, of course, in Beijing's side was also seen as essentially just another defeat. And after a whole summer of more protests and radicalization and escalation. Finally, Beijing withdrew the bill on September 4th. And with that, essentially, it also came with a wholesale reassessment. Okay, you guys do not like to be extradited to across the border? Okay, then we're just going to bring in national security agents to Hong Kong. So this is essentially how we see the culmination. And maybe I should just pass this on to Jeffrey for now.
Jeffrey, 1 minute, let me give you an introduction. So thank you very much, Victoria. And I guess there's a bias putting this panel together towards historians, because now we're joined by Jeffrey Ngo, who is an activist historian of and from Hong Kong, based in Washington. He's currently pursuing his PhD in history at Georgetown University. His writing has appeared in Time, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Hong Kong Free Press, and Dissent. He has an MA and a BA from NYU and was a visiting scholar at the University of Toronto in 2017 and 18. He was a longtime member of Demosisto, the former youth political group, for which he served as chief researcher and a standing committee member. He worked for the Legislative Council election on the campaigns of Au Nakin in 2018 and Nathan Law in 2016. And he's co-organized numerous solidarity rallies, both in Washington and New York, to support Hong Kong's ongoing fight for freedom. So he brings to our panel the voice of experience and the voice of action and a transnational approach to the situation in Hong Kong. Jeffrey, it's all yours.
Yeah, well, thank you for the very kind introduction and for having me here. I mean, even though it's a virtual event and not in person, I mean, being able to speak at the University of Chicago is an honor. I really like the school. So I think Mike and Victoria have provided a very good sort of outline in terms of what has happened, and it's been it was emotional listening to that, and I'll explain a bit why, from a sort of yes, on the one hand I'm a historian, but I'm also an activist who's been involved with a lot of these things on the front line over the years. Mike mentions 4 important points: 2003, 2012, 2014, and 2019. And to me it's a sort of the memories are fresh. In 2003, I was in elementary school. It was the very first time I went to a protest, and I was 7 years old, just about to turn 8 with my parents, and it was about, as Mike said, demonstrating against Article 23, which was a milder version of the national security law, the one that would eventually come into place in 2020. In 2012, I was a secondary school student, and as Victoria said, I was one of the people who went out and protested against the proposal to impose the patriotic education in Hong Kong. In 2014, I was a college student during the umbrella movement. I was actually right here in DC. I was at NYU, but that semester I was studying away at the DC campus. So I actually helped organize rallies in both New York and Washington. I was not in Hong Kong during umbrella, but I was part of the movement as a sort of global solidarity part of it. And in 2019, the big anti-extradition protest, I was in graduate school, and I went back to Hong Kong for the summer, initially supposedly for some research and seeing family and friends, but a lot of that eventually just turned out to going out to protest every single day under the hot sun. And so I think the story of post 1997 Hong Kong is very much also a story of me growing up and looking at the downfall of Hong Kong, the city that that I was born in, grew up in before moving to the US for college, and loved so much. So I think today we talk about human rights, and I want to highlight the Joshua Wong's cases that he's facing. My good friend Joshua, who's now behind bars, and I want to highlight the cases that he's currently facing, just to illustrate in the more specific way the kinds of challenges that youth activists in Hong Kong are going through right now. So he was sent into jail last December for the fourth time. He'd already served 3 different sentences in jail before. But last December, he was sent into jail because of the July 2019 protest. So one of the protests during the anti-extradition movement in 2019. And that very day, I was standing right next to him on that day. And so I was actually part of that. And you know, had I been in Hong Kong, I mean, there's no guarantee that I wouldn't also be targeted. But you know, that day it was we had a big protest outside of the Wan Chai police headquarters, and it was specifically a protest against police brutality, because as Victoria has outlined it, I mean, the actions of the Hong Kong police in recent years has just changed so much, and so we were all there, and Joshua is now being charged and serving in prison for inciting an illegal assembly, and just having, I mean, just having to go to jail because of staging a peaceful protest. That is a very recent phenomenon. Hong Kong has had a long tradition of peaceful protest, and in the past, you know, you might be fined or maybe serve at least at most like 2-3 weeks in prison. And now we're talking about a year or even more than that just for staging a peaceful protest. So you can see increasingly the space that Beijing allows Hong Kongers to sort of operate in terms of civil society and in terms of resistance. That space has really shrank a lot. And then he and then Joshua was sentenced. You know, in addition to serving the first sentence, you know, these charges just pile up, right? So the second one was an anti-mask ban, which is extremely ironic because in 2019, when protesters increasingly were wearing face masks, so they would not be photographed and you know, and have evidence used against them, the Beijing retaliated by banning the wearing of masks. And of course, the irony is that by 2020, there was the COVID-19 pandemic. And so that caused a lot of trouble for the Hong Kong government at first, at the early stages of COVID-19, because the anti-mask ban was still, you know, was still valid. And then they struck it down because of the pandemic. But Joshua is still going to jail because of wearing a mask. And it just shows you the absurdity of the laws that are being put in place and the regulations that are put in place in Hong Kong right now. And of course, the pandemic is not over. And so to have to go to jail for wearing a mask in the middle of a global pandemic, I mean, you know, you can't make this stuff up, right? The third one concerns China more broadly. Since the year 1990, Hong Kong has been holding these huge candlelight vigils every year in memory of the Tiananmen massacre of 1989. And since the 1997 transfer of sovereignty, Hong Kong has been the only place on Chinese soil every year that has been able to hold these events. And for the very first time last year in 2020, that was banned. And the excuse that the government used was that, you know, it was a public health measure because of COVID-19. And the government intends to continue to use the COVID-19 excuse to ban the June 4th candlelight vigil, you know, in 2021, this year, next month, exactly this day next month, actually, because right now is May 4th, next month is June 4th. And you know, and I remember attending, you know, all these candlelight vigils at the Victoria Park in Hong Kong when I was in secondary school, or while I was in college when I went home for summer, and there would be, you know, tens of thousands of people commemorating it, and it is a living memory of the brutality of the Chinese government, and the length that it would go to crack down on dissent, and you know, and how willing it is to abuse human rights. And so so what happened with the third case that Joshua is facing is that he's now arrested and charged, waiting for the sentence to come in, but he's already pled guilty, which was last year, June 4th, because again, the rally was officially banned, but he and a number of others still went to Victoria Park, Netherlands, And as a result, he was charged once again. And we don't know how long that charge is, but you can see again, these charges are piling up, and each charge relate to a specific freedom that Hong Kongers once enjoyed, and are now being chipped away. And the fourth and the final charge that he's right now facing is, of course, the national security law, which carries a maximum of life imprisonment. And the trial has not yet begun, but he and 50 plus other Hong Kong protest organizers and veteran democracy advocates are facing charges of NSL because they organized last year a primary election within the opposition camp. And Beijing's logic is that if you're organizing a primary, that means you're trying to improve your chances to capture a majority in the Legislative Council. And if you are trying to win a majority, despite the rules rigged against you, that means that you are trying to stop Beijing's rule in Hong Kong. So this is how the Chinese government thinks about the separation of powers, which is that once there is genuine separation of power, then that means you're subverting the nation. And of course, that is unacceptable as well, and deemed a violation of national security. And therefore, you're being charged for the national security law. So these cases are still ongoing. As I say, the June 4th one, Joshua pled guilty, but we're waiting to see how long the sentence will be. And the national security law, which concerns basically the whole Hong Kong opposition. I mean, the cliche now is that every single opposition leader you've ever heard of in Hong Kong are now either in jail or in exile. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. That's an exaggeration. I think that's very much the case today. And so I'll wrap up around here, and I'll probably talk a bit more about the U.S. side of things later on in the Q&A if that interests people.
Thank you very much. We are delighted to have you speaking at the University of Chicago. I'm speaking at the University of Chicago from Taipei, actually. So it's a very transnational situation. We can go to questions, please. I should have reminded guests that they could be posting questions throughout the panels, but we have a question that has come in, and then I have a question that I was asked by a student just the other day. But let me give you the first question that came in. Unless, actually, Teng Biao, did you have a question you wanted to ask as a starting question?
Yeah, you may start with our students' question, and then I do have many questions.
Okay, so I have two questions that have come in from students. One is through the Q&A, and one was a question that I was asked during office hours. This question is directed to Dr. Davis. At the time of the handoff, the student writes, I'm interested as to the state of mind of stakeholders both inside and outside of the region. Was there a consensus that the freedoms of those inside Hong Kong enjoyed would be safe for 50 years? Was there a group of people who argued that the freedoms enjoyed by those inside of the UK would erode with a handover never to return? Were there arguments that straddled the line? Thank you for your commentary. And then just to put the two questions together, an unrelated question, but also from a student, has to do with whether or not the national security law is something that a student going to going to Hong Kong through study abroad should have to worry about when they travel to Hong Kong for study abroad. So two different directions, one historical, one very contemporary.
Yes, microphone, got it. Both questions actually work for me because I was a professor for my almost entire career in Hong Kong, and I know what students who come to study in Hong Kong actually do. But let me start with the first one. Was there any sense of optimism? And I know Victoria could weigh in on this one as well. I think there was some optimism. I think Hong Kong people, at the time, Deng Xiaoping was in power when these agreements were reached. China was reforming. And like much of the world, there was an expectation that China seemed to be going in the right direction. It had gotten past its horrible period of the Cultural Revolution. There was a period in China from the Great Leap Forward through the Cultural Revolution when many people thought that, credit to, millions and millions of lost lives due to Chinese government policies. And suddenly there was a leader who was saying something else, who was trying to open things up. He wasn't opening up all the way, but I think people would expect he would be cautious. That you don't want to have chaos flow from the reform process either. So I think there was a sense of optimism. It hadn't been there until the agreement was reached. There was an exodus from Hong Kong leading up to these negotiations and until the Sino-British Treaty was reached in 1984. And then I think there was a sense, well, gee, maybe this will work. It is very inventive, but yeah, it's something that I think people bet on, that they would trust. And Chinese officials went out of their way. And by the way, they didn't just talk to Hong Kong people, they went to the capitals of the world and tried to persuade governments to recognize Hong Kong as a distinct system. So when foreign governments now show up and complain that Hong Kong's autonomy is destroyed, they have good cause for doing so, because they were invited to participate in this Hong Kong very inventive model. So I think there was some, of course, naysayers and people who distrust China's intentions or don't believe, I think the biggest problem would be China's DNA. It's hard for a communist regime to leave its fingers off of an open society. They don't know how to run an open society. So all these safeguards built into the basic law were viewed as very important. But, like you can imagine the question suggests there is some cause for skepticism as well. And I think that's why Hong Kong people engage so fully. Jeffrey talks about these 4 big events. Well, I was at all of them except the last when I was 2019. I wasn't there anymore. But I think people understood that they had to speak up in Hong Kong for what they wanted to maintain. You could say, well, did 2003 cause a big problem? And Beijing doesn't trust anymore. As Victoria pointed out, they didn't trust Hong Kong people. But the alternative is remaining silent. And I think there was a sense in Hong Kong that Hong Kong engagement was part of making one country, 2 systems work. So that I think is it. And probably the caution for a student is now, unfortunately, and my students in the past, maybe because I teach human rights, my students were going to all these protests. So they're coming from abroad, but they're joining and marching on the street. Probably now, if I guess your parents would want me to say, don't go join the protests, to stay out of the street protests because you could get into trouble. And maybe think about your classmates from Hong Kong, not to engage them or, in saying things that could get them into trouble or doing things. I mean, it's just a kind of caution now because everybody's being arrested. I mean, just for carrying signs, for wearing badges, whatever, anything that says anything about Hong Kong's autonomy and so on. So there are risks involved, but if on the other hand, and probably the same ones you would find on mainland China, I wouldn't suggest going out and conducting a big protest in Tiananmen Square either. So that's probably, unfortunately, where Hong Kong is at today.
Yeah, I can add to that is just the other day, I was on another webinar and a former British official was saying that, a lot of this is really done by Hong Kong people inviting Beijing's repression, the efforts to restore law and order. And then he emphasized, Hong Kong people made all these decisions. We have to restore agency. And I was just pretty upset. Speaking of agency, Hong Kong people were completely excluded during the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And not to mention that the United Kingdom had also earlier, as the urging of the Beijing government, taken Hong Kong off the list of colonies, because if you're on the list of these colonies, then there's a better chance that you are entitled to self-determination. And so Hong Kong people could not be involved. And I remember I was a teenager. I watched people just go into panic. We had all of these news that people were trying to exchange every single Hong Kong dollar they had into foreign currencies because they thought Hong Kong was going to collapse. So the Sino-British Joint Declaration, when it was released, came as a relief with all the promises. But then the Sino-British Joint Declaration also stipulates that Beijing would have to turn all of those promises into its own basic law. That happened in 1990. What transpired before 1990 was Tiananmen in 1989. And Tiananmen changed everything. And because at that time there was a population of 6 million, 1.5 million Hong Kong people poured to the street, donated money, donated tents that you see, if you see news footage of all those tents in Tiananmen Square. And from then on, Hong Kong people learned the lesson that if we want to make sure that all those rights and freedoms that were promised in this joint declaration, if those rights can be preserved, if today's Tiananmen does not become tomorrow's Hong Kong, Hong Kong will need to have democracy to defend its freedom. But Beijing learned the opposite lesson. Hong Kong is a potential subversive base, and therefore, from then on, Beijing decided that they would have to do everything to make Hong Kong safe for the CCP. This is why we've been seeing that Hong Kong people have continued to demand democracy, and they used to have the freedom to demand it. This is why every step of the way, Beijing denied democracy, and every single denial would just provoke ever larger, ever more determined protest. And that all culminated in the anti-extradition protest of 2019. And with that, Beijing just came with essentially, for lack of a better term, the ultimate solution to the Hong Kong problem. Finally, to just make Hong Kong essentially the same as the rest of China in order to make Hong Kong safe democracy. Why the Tiananmen annual candlelight vigil is one of the first things to be banned, is because Beijing needs to erase that memory. Hong Kong for 3 decades was the only place on Chinese soil that would continue to commemorate the Tiananmen massacre. And now the same Tiananmen crackdown model is being imposed on Hong Kong, including not just the beatings and the physical repression itself, but also the fomentation of quote unquote riots and the framing of protesters as rioters, and also rewriting the truth and setting aside everything that, whatever the security forces did, and also imposition of national education to create amnesia. And this is a very sad case. Now, at the time, people were very worried. I remember all the way up to June 30th, right before the handover, there were all of these longitudinal surveys asking Hong Kong people, well, if given a choice, would you prefer Hong Kong to be handed back to China, or would you prefer to keep the status quo? Up to the last minute, every single survey showed that Hong Kong people opted for the maintenance of the status quo, to stay as a British colony. And this is a very important thing, but people had no choice. Hong Kong people were completely deprived of the agency. And so when you have no choice, people accepted the reality that we have to live with this. We just have to see how this is going to go. The other day, a student, when writing a statement, made a slip that I thought was basically, he didn't know that, but it's a brilliant Freudian slip. He talked about, he meant to say that one country, two systems model is probably not going to work, it's never meant to work. But he miswrote one party, two systems. I thought that was a very brilliant stroke, because one country, two systems would be kind of like federalism. It could work, but that one country has to be a democracy. Only when you have a democracy that you can have different systems and they can coexist with local autonomy. If the one country is not a democracy, look at Russia, then federalism would not work. And so the system that theoretically could have worked, but it is one party, two systems that made it impossible for the model to work And this is why we see today, eventually, it is now one party, one system.
Yeah, just very, very quickly adding to that, I was obviously too young in 1997 to remember what the state of the mind was. But I think it's important to stress that there was no unified sentiment. Different people thought different things. And, in light of the current situation, obviously, it is easy to romanticize the past and think, oh, what a better time it was. But I think Victoria is very correct. I mean, Hong Kongers were always screwed, with the listing of the Hong Kong from the UN list of non-self-governing territories, and hence the loss of the right of self-determination not being given a voice in the Sino-British negotiations leading to the joint declaration. And so I think, yes, in the 1990s, some Hong Kongers might have thought maybe this could work, but even then, I mean, Hong Kong was never fully democratic. Hong Kongers were never given the right of self-determination, and I think that is a very important point to make.
Can I add one little point here that's really interesting to me? In 1985, 1 year after the Sino-British Treaty was signed, I asked my class in Hong Kong, what alternative would you want to occur? Is there anything? And first, my class rejected the question. They said, well, no one asked us. This is the British and the Chinese reached this deal, not us. No one asked. I said, well, humor me. I've just arrived in Hong Kong, and I'm just curious whether you have an ideal model you would prefer. And it was interesting. It kind of showed that there was not a hatred towards China. Their answer was, we would want Hong Kong returned to China, and then China hire the British to run it. And that was apparently at the time something that was going around on the street at the time, and people were hearing, because this was already too late. The agreement was signed, but they trusted the British system of government, but there wasn't a complete rejection of Chinese identity. I don't think you could say that today. That would no longer be the answer to the question, but it was quite interesting. It was almost unanimous. Only one student didn't take that position.
That reminds me a little bit of the way I think of activists used to thread the needle in the late 90s, when you'd have a Tibetan or a Taiwanese or a Hong Kong person speaking with a mainland activist, and the conversation would go something like, well, you'd want to be part of China if China were the place I want it to be. So yes, that activist would try to have a view of Chinese sovereignty that was palatable to the PRC vision of the integrity of the country, actually, but that was also an agenda of democracy, and say, if my revolution happened in China and we had a democratic China, of course you'd want to be part of China. Yeah. So that the kind of contortions that people go to be able to talk. But I think we were in a different world in the 80s and the 90s, and now a lot is much more clear about the way this regime operates. Teng Biao, did you want to ask another question? I have another question.
Yeah. So I agree with Victoria's argument that the one country, two system won't work if that country is not democratic. So in the first place, I think the fate of Hong Kong's rule of law and freedom was kind of doomed. My question is, Hong Kong protesters took to the street to protest against Hong Kong government, but everyone knows the order is from Beijing. So what's Hong Kong people's evaluation of Beijing's political consideration? So why Beijing decided to eliminate Hong Kong's rule of law? Or specifically, is it more of Xi Jinping's political agenda, or you saw a continuity after 1997? Thank you.
So I suppose the question is, for me, why would Xi Jinping do this? we cannot really read his mind, but at the same time, it's also falls into this, consistent with the larger trend. And it didn't even begin with Xi Jinping. It actually had to happen before. So already before Xi Jinping came to power, already the Beijing leadership was already taking increasingly aggressive actions toward Japan and Taiwan, and then the Philippines. And so it was when Xi Jinping came to power, he did speed things up, building artificial islands on these reefs in the South China Sea. He promised Obama that, I'm not going to militarize these islands, but then he went on to do exactly the same thing. And then when news first emerged that there were these, there was a really, really huge unprecedented crackdown on Xinjiang. First, people didn't believe in these Uyghurs who work for the Radio Free Asia. But then when we also had information, when Professor Sands used these tenders, why is it that Beijing, the Xinjiang authorities were just calling for exactly identical tenders for all of these lookalike huge facilities? And then another student in Canada looked at satellite images of what many Xinjiang cities looked like several years ago and what Xinjiang looked like today. And so with overwhelming evidence that with these concentration camps, the world continued to look the other way. So if the world looked the other way or didn't say anything or said something, but didn't really do anything about the repression in Tibet, and Beijing transferred the crackdown model from Tibet to Xinjiang, took over these islands, increases Beijing's claim over the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Nobody did seem to say anything. And then in Hong Kong, after the umbrella movement, the crackdown intensified. Legislators were disqualified. And there were reinterpretation of the basic law through the National People's Congress Standing Committee decisions. And what did the United Kingdom and the US did? The UK's Foreign Office biannual reports and the US Department of State's annual reports continue to say that, well, there are these concerns, but despite these concerns, including the abduction of Libor from Hong Kong to taken over to mainland China, despite all of these violations, one country, two systems has continued to stay strong in Hong Kong. So with all of those things, the world did not do anything, looks the other way, continue to sign business deals with Beijing. So if you're Xi Jinping, whose China dream is to become the greatest leader in history, and given that actually my core research is historical, that every single new emperor always came to power wanting to surpass and outdo previous ones. And for him, the China dream is to be so powerful that it can dominate the United States and achieve grand unity. So Hong Kong has to be on the agenda. This is also why now the rest of the world rightfully should be very worried. What is next? Taiwan.
Michael, you're on mute.
No, I know we have time limitations, so I thought Victoria's answer was fine. So maybe the next question would be good.
I have a technical question, which is, was the national security law, and maybe this is a question, I maybe have two questions. One is a question that might be more in Victoria and Michael's wheelhouse, and one that might be more for Jeffrey. So my question about seeing, and because I'm a historian, I'm not good at seeing anything about the future. Was the national security law always the end game? Even when the extradition law was the extradition law a step towards the national security law? Or was the failure of the extradition law a reason to ramp things up? Again, this is a little bit asking you to look into the mind of Beijing. So and what does that mean if we had an answer to that, which we can't probably know? If we had an answer to that, what would it tell us? And then there's a question in a good question in the chat that came in that I'm going to compress a bit to ask how the national security law will impact the way Hong Kong people protest or express themselves politically in the future. Michael, I think you're somewhat optimistic in thinking that there would be protests for a study abroad student to even accidentally stumble into. So what space remains on the ground in Hong Kong for political participation? And what is the impact of the national security law? And then there's I guess we haven't talked very much about what the loss in the area of judicial separation and what that means for Hong Kong. So if anybody wants to speak about that in our remaining time.
Your first question was again what?
The way in which whether the national security law was an inevitable policy on Beijing's part, or whether or not that extradition law was a first step towards implementing that, or would they, if they'd won the extradition law fight, would that have been enough for Beijing for a little while? You know, what does the rollout from Beijing's rollout of control from Beijing's point of view look like?
Well, as the lawyer on the panel, I'll take up some of this stuff. I think it was the inevitable end of the road, except it was, and we don't have to do mind reading, it was in the Basic Law. Article 23 of the Basic Law provided that Hong Kong was to enact such a law on its own. So either there was going to be a law of this type enacted by the Hong Kong government on its own, and the Hong Kong government made no initiative to try to do so in a way that was compliant with its obligations under the ICCPR. So they then just left it on the table, and I guess Carrie Lam then faced this problem as she took office. There was a speculation that after C.Y. Leung and the previous CEs said, well, we're not going to touch this issue because we know it's so sensitive. I think the expectation was Carrie Lam was going to actually come forward with the Article 23 proposal, that it was time to try it. And there was a lot of pressure from Beijing to do so. So in a way, we're a bit surprised because they'd been negotiating over an extradition law for years and they couldn't agree on it. Oddly, even the Hong Kong government couldn't agree with them because it involved so much the wholesale surrender of basic rights that are guaranteed in Hong Kong. And yet somehow Carrie Lam, she says she came up with this on her own. I'm skeptical about that. But however she came up with it, she decided to test the waters with this Article 23 with the extradition bill. And I have no doubt if the extradition bill sailed through that she would then turn to the Article 23 legislation. I have no doubt about that. And then at the failure of that extradition bill to go through, it's, of course, as I think Victoria's already discussed, it certainly gave China the inclination then to step in on its own and violate its commitments, because no longer is this bill being enacted on its own. They try to hide under the cover that they're imposing a national law under Annex 3 of the Basic Law, which Article, I think it's 18, the Basic Law allows for. But I don't think Article 18 ever contemplated China enacting a law only for Hong Kong, a local law. Rather, it was to bring national laws to apply in Hong Kong. And they did some laws regarding flags and ceremonies and so on. So I think the Article 23 was going to happen, or the national security law. And otherwise, I think the whole idea that of political participation, I think, is pretty much out the window. I wasn't suggesting optimistically that students would be going to protest every day, but I do expect, and we saw it, like little protests emerge from time to time. One did at Chinese U, for example, recently in conjunction with graduation. And so people are so outraged that sometimes, actually at great risk to themselves, they try to find ways to object, and some of the media try to object. And so there are various kinds of ways. I don't think Hong Kong people are going to be completely silenced. But when it comes to running in these offices, I think my guess is they're just going to boycott the elections, that most of the political activists from the past and political participants, legislators, whoever, if they're not in jail, are simply not going to run. And Hong Kong government thinks so as well. So they just localized this election provisions by including a provision that bans anyone from advocating that blank ballots be submitted or the election be boycotted, that this is a crime now that can get you, I think, up to 3 years in prison. So if Hong Kong people are going to submit blank ballots or boycott the election, I think it's just going to be whispered around town. It's not going to be some concerted effort to advocate this, because you're going to go to jail if you do. But I think protest is going to take different shapes, and Victoria is the expert on different forms that protests might take. She teaches courses on contentious politics, so I'll let her jump in there. On the legal stuff, if there are more, I saw that question in a Q&A, if there are more parts of it, maybe I'll add one at least, the separation of powers, which you also brought up. Clearly, they oppose separation of powers. They opposed it in the mainland for years. There have been proposals by academics like Teng Biao and others that there be a kind of judicial review system or something that could be adopted in China, because civil law systems have constitutional courts. No, that's never allowed, none of it even considered. And in Hong Kong, they view the idea of separation of powers as undermining their authority. And so in fact, they've threatened to stop the courts. That the person who asked the question also asked, was there judicial review? Yes, there was constitutional judicial review in Hong Kong. It's been very active, the courts have. They've overturned various kinds of laws, and people can challenge executive actions much as they could in Britain in many ways, and the United States. But Chinese government officials have from time to time attacked that and said, no, this is not appropriate. There's no provision in the basic law for courts to do this. So the courts in Hong Kong have operated under this threat that their powers will be cut off or diminished. And of course, with the new national security law and the new election provisions, their powers are in effect cut off. They're not able to review the national security law itself. The Court of Final Appeal made that clear when Beijing, in a People's Daily article, essentially threatened that if the court didn't rule the way they want, that they will send in that case, the defendant, Jimmy Lai, to the mainland for trial. So the courts are under a lot of intimidation because Beijing really does not like having an independent judicial system that can challenge its authority.
Yeah, so the multiple question. The first one is that what was the end game? I think that everyone was expecting legislation of Article 23 in the aftermath of the anti-extradition protest. But I don't think anyone expected it to come so harsh. So when Beijing announced that it was going to impose the national security law, everyone was like, this is really just horrible. And then when we saw the actual clauses, it was even worse than we had expected during the month of May when we were expecting this to happen. And so it's really, really harsh. And why would they do that? I would say it is probably Xi Jinping's calling the shots that we just really have to put the Hong Kong issue, the Hong Kong problem, just put it away, kill it once for all, so that Hong Kong can no longer present any problems for the CCP. When it comes to protest dissent, essentially any form of dissent is criminalized. You have to really brave arrest and very serious arrest. So the protests at Chinese U that Mike mentioned, students, because they were also holding banners and slogans that had been banned under the national security law, Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Times. So therefore these students, and the Chinese University campus police called the police to come in to investigate students. It is that bad. And how worried people are. So this morning I had a class and I invited, because another two classes at Notre Dame, they also wanted me to talk to them about Hong Kong. So I opened up the class, and I typically record all my classes. And I told the other professors that I'm just going to record my classes as usual. We know that there are Chinese students there, but they can, turn off the video, they can register with pseudonym, whatever. And then my colleague, just essentially before I started, apparently she logged in early and make sure to turn off the recording. I learned that only afterwards, and I don't blame her because people are very afraid. The fact that we are all from Hong Kong and we can still talk about these issues because we are not in Hong Kong and we cannot go back. And it's just really hard. What about people in Hong Kong? What could they do? We have to resort to what James Scott would call everyday forms of resistance. And Hong Kong people are also learning lessons from Prague Spring, and they're learning lessons from Havel's Living in Truth. So people can continue to whisper, people can continue to support each other by going to these yellow shops, in the yellow economic circle. People continue, maybe they can burn candles, but open dissent is criminalized. It is pretty sad.
Yeah, just very quickly. I think, in the past, I mean, the two big ways to, two main ways for Hong Kongers to express dissent was through elections and through protests. And both of those things are basically gone now because of the electoral reform. I mean, in 2014, we were saying, rather than having half of the legislative council elected, let's have that fully elected and also the chief executive as well. Now, obviously, the chief executive, there's no way to elect that, but rather than at least half of the legislative council, in the new proposal that was just rolled out a couple of weeks ago, in the new proposal, out of 90 seats, only 20 could be directly elected. So a little more than 1 in 5, rather than 1 in 2. So the space is really shrinking, and I think, yes, there's going to be small protests, but there's going to be no leaders because they're all in jail. They're all going to be illegal by default because the police will not issue the permits. I mean, we're still in the pandemic, so they're still using COVID-19 as an excuse. We don't know how it's going to be after the pandemic, but I don't anticipate the police to issue permits. And I think Mike is right that, when you don't have a big protest, you have small protests, but actually small protests are more dangerous than large ones. Because you can easily get rounded up, given the police presence. So it's quite tough.
Any more questions?
Teng Biao, did you want to ask another question? I have another one too. But.
Yes. So regarding the national security law, so I call the article between Article 55 to 61. I call them Causeway Bay articles because that's related to the abduction of the publisher Gui Minhai and then the Causeway Bay bookstore sellers. But many people, like the international community, concerned about the Article 38 actually targeting everyone in the world. If you criticize Beijing in terms of Hong Kong policy or advocate Hong Kong democracy, Hong Kong independence, you can be arrested when you travel or transfer flight in Hong Kong. So, what's your comment about this, and what's the influence of the kidnap of Gui Minhai and other booksellers in Hong Kong and in Thailand?
Well, I'll do the legal side of it, and Victoria probably has, and Jeffrey may have comments on the influence of it. But yeah, the law is very explicit that it reaches people anywhere in the world. Frankly, what we're saying right here may make all of us subject to, if they want to attack us, they somehow interpret, because the 4 crimes, and I'm sorry for the 12 minutes, I just couldn't touch on all the topics. I mean, some real sensitive ones like transferring of people to the mainland for trial and everything, and the global reach of the law, but also the 4 crimes under it: secession, subversion, terrorism, and colluding with foreign forces, are all very broadly stated and can be, is it colluding with foreign forces even to make arguments? Why Victoria's colleague would be concerned about students recording what students might say in a class in South Bend, Indiana, You know, technically, I guess someone, if they're displeased with these events, there's so much of it that they probably won't bother with the class in South Bend, Indiana. But nonetheless, there is that scope. The law really doesn't limit that at all. And I think this has been one reason international, you know, parliaments and so on have been very attentive to it. So while, you know, we don't know how aggressively they will use this capacity, it in some ways is a double-edged sword for them, because it also enables foreign governments to take a very strong interest in what China's doing in Hong Kong. Victoria may have more to say on your comment.
Well, so we actually had Angela Gui talking about her experience as well, but at the same time, essentially, the abduction of Li Bo from Hong Kong, Gui Minhai was abducted from Thailand, so it was illegal under the Basic Law, because the national security forces were not supposed to operate in Hong Kong. And again, kind of back to what I was saying earlier, if the extradition bill was basically would have legalized this kind of abduction that had happened several times before. And this is why Hong Kong people were so up in arms about it. But Beijing's response is, if you guys do not like to be taken across the border, and then we'll just bring the national security agents from Beijing to Hong Kong. So this is where we wind up. I would also note one more thing is that we shouldn't think of Beijing having these grand plans like in the end game way ahead of time. What the CCP has been very good at doing is taking advantage of what is going on. COVID-19 is a good example. They obviously didn't really want to see the outbreak of COVID-19. When it hits, it was awful. It hits them very hard. But then it occurred to them that they could use COVID-19 to completely stifle free speech in Hong Kong. And so this is the kind of thing that we should understand how CCP operates as well.
Jeffrey, you have.
Well, I mean, do we have further question? I mean, I think we are running short of time, so I don't have anything.
I just got the green light from our tech team to go for 10 more minutes. If you guys want to go for a little bit longer and talk, and,
yeah.
And then for members of the panel, I sent you the link to my office as well.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Do you have? I mean, do you have additional questions? I think Victoria and Mike answered those very well.
I don't know if you, Jeffrey, if you'd like to speak a bit more about the experience of people in your generation who are caught on both sides of political activism within Hong Kong and political activism overseas, and how you see your role. And I guess there's a role and a responsibility to being in exile, and how that might be similar for someone from Hong Kong or different from someone from Hong Kong. Teng Biao is also in exile. And then another area that I think would be interesting to connect to is we often see on Twitter and other social media things that Stand with Hong Kong has become like Stand with the Uyghurs as well. And so what kinds of collaborative activism are possible? How might that, how that might work in the international community? You had mentioned being willing to talk about things that are going on with Congress. I know all of you have weighed in different ways in the congressional or the public forum in the United States. So maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about that before we wrap up.
Yeah, I can connect those thoughts. With our generation, I mean, a lot of the leaders, as I said, are in jail, and and I think those who have decided to stay behind are tremendously courageous. And I left for the last time in the summer of 2019 just because the fall semester was going to begin before the end of the protest. So I just came back and now I don't think there's an opportunity for me to be in Hong Kong anymore, even though I'm technically not in exile effectively, I think, that's very likely going to be the case. And so I think, I said earlier, the two ways to express political dissent in Hong Kong itself, number one, protest, number two, elections are not very possible. So I think the in the near future, at least, those who will still be able to engage in this kind of public sphere against Beijing's actions in Hong Kong has to be the people who are in this growing diaspora. And again, a lot of these folks I know, of course, but some of them are not technically in exile, but they don't see themselves returning anytime soon. And others have already applied for asylum and refugee statuses, etc., which makes it quite relevant, to think about Hong Kong and human rights from the U.S. perspective, because, and not just the U.S., but in Australia and Canada, etc. I mean, there are all these groups and activists asking their respective governments in Western democracies to open up quotas and avenues for Hong Kongers who are facing political persecution to apply and to be able to come in. And of course, in the U.S., that's very relevant to the news, because just yesterday, President Biden has increased the refugee quotas in the U.S. And so I anticipate that more and more Hong Kongers in the near future will leave, especially after COVID, and with travel restrictions around the world easing. But of course, travel restrictions that are Hong Kong specific will still be in place. In fact, the Hong Kong government just passed a law that would allow them to block people from leaving, targeted people from leaving, even if they have all the travel documentations. So it's going to be tough no matter what, but it's perhaps going to be slightly easier once the pandemic is over. And so I think, among the things that we've been doing in the Congress is to lobby for the passage of the Hong Kong Safe Harbor Act, which is a piece of legislation that would allow more quotas specifically for Hong Kongers to come to the US. And I think that's very helpful. And it also relates, speaking of the work in Congress, to other struggles for freedom, including in Xinjiang, in Tibet, and other places, because I think, yes, there's been this consciousness among Hong Kongers for quite some years now that our struggle for freedom is connected to the struggles for freedom among other ethnic minority groups under Beijing's control. But to actually be able to work with Uyghur groups, Tibetan groups, has been almost impossible in Hong Kong, because those groups have no presence in Hong Kong, but they have presence in DC and elsewhere. So I think by virtue of being in the US and in the cases of other youth activists who are in exile in foreign countries, actually allow us to be able to work with these groups, and not just groups from Tibet and Xinjiang, but even say Thailand and Burma, etc. And I think there's a case that to be made that transnational solidarity can be built in these foreign cities, much like interwar Paris, with all the this is history, but with all the radical 20th century activists. I mean, they all met in Paris, right? So it's sort of like, can Washington or can London be this new place for 21st century activists in Asia trying to fight against authoritarianism, a place to work together, and I think there's a lot of potential for that.
Since I'm currently based in Taiwan, in Taipei, can I propose Taiwan and ask you to react to the potential for Taiwan to be helpful to Hong Kong and the potential for Taiwan to learn from Hong Kong in terms of its own brewing situation?
Yeah, you are, according to the Economist, in the most dangerous place in the world right now. So, but yeah, once COVID is gone, I mean, hopefully we'll also be able to go to Taiwan.
Let me add that. So Jeffrey didn't say the magic term, which is the Milky Alliance. It started off with, we started off with essentially youngsters from Taiwan and Hong Kong getting together after the Sunflower movement in Taiwan and the umbrella movement in Hong Kong. I believe that it is Joshua Wong who coined the term when the protests broke out in Thailand in 2019, and came up with this term Milky Alliance, because the idea is, if you ask the rest of the world to stand with Hong Kong, we have to stand with other people when they are protesting as well. And then with the protests in Burma, in Myanmar, then also we extending to these places. And it so happened that these places all drink tea with milk. That they are former British colonies or they are herders, and therefore they drink tea with milk. And then another thing is that I also want to emphasize before we close is everyone here, everyone in the audience can help. In a way, it is very easy because when we want to push through this legislation, one thing is that, you know, why would these members of Congress or why would people in the White House actually do something? One is because it is a moral concern, it is the right thing to do. And two is that it is good for competition. But the most importantly is because they think that their voters, their constituents actually care about it. So if you guys could go to hkdc.us and click on take action, and it will take you directly to how you can email directly to senators and member and House of Representative member in your district, in your zip code.
Oh, I have to mention, since people are in Chicago, I think at least a good number of people are in Chicago. Dick Durbin has been a very good advocate, and he's the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which oversees immigration policy.
And politicians like to hear when they're doing things right too. So that's probably worth reinforcing, even if it's Hong Kong, the case isn't over. So you can tell them these. Are there any other sort of action items that the panelists would like to share with the audience? It's nice to end on a positive note and thinking about the Milky Alliance and all these global cities becoming the site of Renaissance is really an exciting place to end it. But is there anything anyone would like to add? We'll say good night.
Yeah, let me also just say that it is really sad to see how Hong Kong has descended, how far and how fast. But at the same time, so what a lot of Hong Kong people holding on to is that, well, Hong Kong as a place, Hong Kong as a home, we cannot go back home. Hong Kong as a place that we grew up, it's gone. But we are still carrying around Hong Kong as an idea, Hong Kong as a set of values, Hong Kong as this set of basically, which stands for freedom, autonomy, and democracy. These are the things that we're carrying around with us. People talk about building a mini Hong Kong in Scotland or somewhere. People have been discussing which is exactly the best place. But Hong Kong people are just going to splash over in different places. And the diaspora is at the same time, because we're everywhere, it means also that one thing people need to hold on to the identity and culture, at the same time also work together. Last year with the US Census, the first time Hong Kong Americans put down, instead of saying Chinese American, they put down others and put hand wrote in Hong Kongers. So we're going to see, you know, the size of Hong Kong Americans here.
I would just add, and it relates to the question that was raised earlier, as someone who spent my whole life working on human rights in various places in the world, is that you don't have to other people. So if students go to Hong Kong, at least one thing they can do is just relate to the society, become a Hong Konger. I mean, I think of myself as a Hong Konger. I've lived over 30 years in Hong Kong, that we don't have to always think of ourselves as somebody on the outside, because you have to be part of what people, that's to me what human rights work is about. It's engaging with people everywhere, just joining in and in a way of mutual respect and not kind of something that's otherized that belongs to someone else. So that I think for students, I know this started out as a class for at least your students, that they can think of how to engage and if they do go to study abroad, to join and be a part of the society and not just standing outside it all the time. I think we silence here.
So before we end our event, I made a advertisement next week on May 18th. We'll have another webinar on Tiananmen. So we'll have panelists Andy Nathan, Perry Link, Louis Salam, and Ura Kaisi. Okay, so welcome to join us,
And
Johanna.
actually, Teng Biao, I just thought of something we should add about that, which is one of the things Louisa Lim has said she wants to talk about is her work with Andy Nathan talking about the Tiananmen playbook and its relevance to Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So there's a bridge between these two panels. I'd
Sure.
forgotten that I wanted to mention.
Sure, yeah. Johanna, you. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists and all the audience. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank you, everyone.
for organizing it.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thanks.
Yeah.